We will always remember the brave U of T students that gave their lives.
To all those U of T alumni that we can't remember, we salute and we remember you.
On November 11th, take a minute and remember all those students that gave their lives for freedom.
Flying Officer George David Beatty.
Flying Officer James Fraser.
Lieutenant Charles Alfred Chen.
Flight Lieutenant David Alexander Cummings Crook.
Flying Officer Chester Archibald Stewart Ferrier.
Flight Sergeant Gordon Haig.
Pilot Officer David Lewis Jacobs.
Major George Schofield.
Captain Alexander Stewart.
Flight Officer William Van Stocken.
Lieutenant Thomas Wright.
Flight Lieutenant Gordon Kidder.
Surgeon Lieutenant Jared Vining McCutcheon.
Flight Lieutenant Herbert Mitchell.
Lieutenant John Moreau Murray.
Flight Officer Frank Patterson. Lieutenant Hubert Hedler.
Flight Lieutenant Reverend Andrew Lintoul.
Action Officer John Burgess Atkinson.
Warrant Officer Walter Stanley Beatty.
Pilot Officer Harold Francis Burt Jaron.
Lieutenant Charles William Cooper.
Corporal William Charles Dewar.
Captain Herbert Gage.
Captain Robert Wesley Harcourt.
Lieutenant Kenneth John Ray. Captain Philip Seaver.
Paymaster Commander Frederick Owen Scudder.
Pilot Officer Ronald Weller.
Major Reginald Yelland.
Rifleman John Luscombe. Pilot Officer Paul Clark McGillicuddy.
Sergeant Charles Richard Morley.
Lieutenant Jeffrey Noyes.
Flight Sergeant Gordon Patterson.
Pilot Officer William Rowland.
Flight Officer Harry Reid.
Lieutenant John Delury Barber.
Pilot Officer Howard Bruce Body.
Lieutenant James Alexander Quasi Carrick.
Flying Officer Bruce Sherwood Corbett.
Lieutenant David Mung Dickey.
Pilot Officer Robert Godfrey.
Pilot Officer Robert Lloyd Henry.
Major Harold Williams.
Major Robert Slater.
Flight Officer Robert Philpott Swallow.
Sergeant John Duncan White.
Flight Lieutenant Isaac Sealer.
Captain John McAllister.
Pilot Officer David Alexander McAllister.
Major John Forbes Morlock.
Lieutenant Rupert Simpson Oakley.
Flight Sergeant James Patterson.
Pilot Officer Arthur Rottenberg.
Wing Commander George Reed.
Pilot Officer Robert John Barber.
William Michael Bullen.
Flying Officer Herbert George Christie.
Flying Lieutenant Edward Morris Cowper.
Pilot Officer Douglas Murray Elliott.
Pilot Officer John Fraser Gray.
Lieutenant Theodore Herman.
Lieutenant Oscar Rumble.
Captain Anthony Smith and Captain Malcolm Smith.
Lieutenant Harry Tatterfall.
Captain John Jewell.
Major Wallace McPherson.
Pilot Officer David Alexander McMaster.
Private Carl Hamilton Mora.
Lance Corporal Peter O'Brien.
Flight Officer William Patterson.
Flight Officer William Rogers.
Lieutenant Amos Reagan.
Flight Lieutenant John Malcolm Barr.
Flying Officer George Gordon Bradshaw.
Captain James Frederick Mills Hall.
Pilot Officer Charles Maurice Crabtree.
Lieutenant Keith Donald Ferris.
Flight Sergeant Mayor Greenstein.
Flying Officer William James Irwin.
Captain Leonard Salter.
Flight Officer Lou Ryan Summers.
Lieutenant John Terrace.
Lieutenant William Wood.
Flight Lieutenant John Jones.
Lieutenant William McGee.
Flight Officer Albert Milton.
Lieutenant Sidney John Moulter.
Staff Lieutenant Thomas Alcott. Lieutenant Harold Patton.
Flight Sergeant Reginald Francis Robb.
Sergeant Observer Robert Coulter.
We will always remember the brave U of T students that gave their lives.